meeting today is so that we can better connect you all, both with the department and, of course, the work that you all are doing. So extraordinarily grateful for you taking even more of your time, because I recognize all of you are volunteers in your roles with your respective boards. And, you know, as somebody who can barely manage 2 kids in sports and work and all the things that I'm sure all of you are managing too, I understand. So, you know, I think the other place I'll start today is really around something that everybody's thinking about, which is the election. And you know, at least for another week here, that's what everybody will probably continue talking about. But one thing people don't understand about government, and particularly good government, is elections aren't the beginning, middle, and end of good government, right? Work on boards and committees, work in these halls, in these offices, that's where good government happens. That's where doing sort of the day-to-day grind makes the services we provide and the underpinning that we provide to the citizens of Wisconsin possible. And so that's another reason why I wanted to underscore the importance of why we're here and the work that you all do. I wanted to start off with some interesting examples of some of the work that the boards are doing. And I know we're going to hear from some of the boards in a little bit, so I'm not going to go into great detail, but I did want to highlight Wisconsin and many of your boards aren't just keeping the trains running, right? It's not just the grind of discipline and the grind of updating rules. Many of you are doing leading edge work here in the state of Wisconsin, and really by comparison throughout the country, and there are some really great examples. So one example is our Interdisciplinary Advisory Council. That's a council made up of many of our prescribing professions, and that's really to get after and address the ongoing lack of regulation in sort of the med spa and cash for service medical industry. Many of the traditional regulatory sort of levels of oversight don't adequately address what's happening in those environments, and so I know we're very excited about the work that group is doing. We also have our Mass Timber Council. I sort of perpetually shortly, but I understand that in reality shortly we will be coming out with a Mass Timber building package, and in essence an appendix to our existing building package that says, hey, look at the work and the investment that communities have made, like in Milwaukee with the Ascent, and the research and development that's gone on even just here in Madison with the Forest Products Lab. And let's take that and bring that into our building code so that we're not just relying on what people are doing nationally. We're also taking our research and using that to further what's happening in the built industry and built environment here in the state of Wisconsin. We have our Advisory Council on Sustainable Building. That in many ways is bringing together sort of an interdisciplinary group to make recommendations to our broader building code councils about some of the ways that we can be innovative. And I think one thing I'll highlight is that oftentimes there's this view that the building code is prescriptive. There's this view that if we set a certain standard in the building code, that it's going to automatically be more expensive, or that it's automatically going to stifle innovation. And I think that's in my opinion, a very basic view of regulation. And in the case of the building code, oftentimes what we're talking about is actually incorporating new technology and incorporating new ways of doing building buildings that can be not just more sustainable, but also less expensive, or provide other net benefits like being able to build on smaller footprint, thereby decreasing costs and things like that. Our nursing board is actually working on a rural project to make it possible for Canadian grads to directly enter the U.S. workforce as APNPs, so we're very excited about that. The CSB and Med Board had done a lot of work recently providing feedback to DHS, directly impacting the outcomes of their rule projects and incorporating the views of the professions on some of those DHS projects. So sort of across a broad spectrum of places, our boards are being innovative, and our boards are driving forward our professions and quite frankly, our entire industry set here in the state of Wisconsin. So with that, I did want to jump into a few things that the department has been up to. Many of you are well aware of sort of where we were 2 to 3 years ago with credentialing and the need to modernize systems and the work that we did there. And we did that, and then sort of we took a step back and we said, all right, what's the next level of that? Because it's one thing to offer an electronic platform to people, and it's quite another thing to start to try to reimagine in many ways the way that historic processes have worked and the way in which those impact ultimately the speed with which people are able to get a license here in the state of Wisconsin. And I'll give you one short example of that. When I first entered this role, I took a look at the nursing workforce and I said, all right, let me map this out. Let me just get a piece of paper out, let me draw this out and identify how many days do I think it should take a nurse, like reasonably, to get through this process. If they do everything right, what should it take? And when I mapped it out, it was 47 days, right? 47 days is not short by most people's estimation in this day and age. And so I said, okay, what is the shortest version of this process that I can imagine? And so in collaboration with the nursing board, we set to work looking at these processes and reimagining them in a way to give them the maximum amount of opportunity to drive their timeline, right? To drive forward the speed with which they want to move through that process. Now I have to say, not every nurse is going to be prepared or ready to move through that process at warp speed, right? They may need more time to study for a national exam. They may have other things in their lives that contribute to longer time frames. But let's work to minimize the amount of time frame that the department contributes to that scope. And so the first thing we did was we created, or the first thing we did it with the help of the nursing board was to, all right, lost my place, sorry, was to create a passive review for education. So one of the things that was a factor in nursing was that they were required to, or we were required to review for graduation prior to authorizing them to take the exam. And so with a small tweak, we were able to actually create a process I call passive review, which allows us to conduct that review prior to issuing the license, but to allow them to take that exam as soon as they graduate. The second thing that we did was that we created a LEAP portal. So this is another key piece that extends beyond nursing, and this LEAP portal has now been expanded to include all of our licensed healthcare professions, but allows our Wisconsin-based universities and colleges to directly approve graduation in our system electronically, eliminating up to 3 weeks of time that it was taking to review that graduation doc and submit that graduation documentation. And then the last step we took was really around, again, that empowerment piece. And it was about saying to the nursing schools, okay, you have the authority within statute to authorize your students to test early. You establish the criteria by which you want to allow your students to test early, and then agree to execute on that. Agree to have a program in place so your students know that if they're interested in testing early, they can come to you and demonstrate that they've met the requirements and that you'll approve them, again, in the department's LEAP portal to test early. So why is all this critical? All this is critical because, quite frankly, testing makes up over 80% of the time it takes to get a license in the state of Wisconsin. And in fact, the latest numbers that I have was for nursing, I believe it was over 90% of the time it took to get a license was actually not the time where the application was spent in the department's hands. It was time where we as the department spent waiting on materials from the applicant. So again, so I bring up all of this to say, because all of that feeds into sort of our how do I put it? I would say our worldview as the department about how are we executing on these responsibilities across all of our professions. And since that time, we've taken a number of steps to sort of move profession by profession through these processes and take sometimes similar but sometimes different steps depending on the profession. So I'll also highlight pharmacy. We are in the process of finalizing a pharmacy integration with the National Association of Pharmacy Boards, which is a testing organization, so that those test scores will come back now automatically, just like we have now with nursing. And we recently worked with NABP to also convert the law exam, which is required of students. So in pharmacy, students have two exams. They have a law exam and the NAPLEX, which is the national exam. And I know John Whitecamp's here, so I don't know where he's sitting. Oh, he's over there. So I'll give John a shout out because John and his pharmacy board worked directly with us to execute on this in concert with NABP. And I remember, John, we got together with all 3 pharmacy schools, and we sort of went in hot with NABP, and we were like, we got to get this done. And thankfully, NABP was ready. They were equally as interested. So we've got this pilot program where the law exam now, instead of being the last step in the licensing process, is something they can actually take before their clinical year. So not only can they take it before they graduate, but they can actually take it before they enter a clinical environment, which in our estimation is a much more valuable placement for that exam than being a postgraduate exam. And as John knows, that's usually the last step for a student because they want to take their national exam first, and then they're going to take that law exam as the last step. And so in essence, that period of time, whatever it is for a student, a week, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, we've now eliminated that entire step from the postgraduate process. And then the third thing we did with the pharmacy students was they now can schedule early. So they can log into NABP instead of after they graduate, I believe it's 6 weeks in advance of graduation, and reserve that testing spot so that they're ready upon graduation to go ahead and take that test. With our dental board, there's been some media around this, but we worked with our dental examining board. Is anyone from our dental board here today? Nope. To create, in essence, what we're calling dental diploma privilege. Many of you may know that here in Wisconsin, if you graduate from law school at either Marquette or UW, you do not have to take the state bar exam to be admitted to the bar. So our dental students have 2 national exams they take, one after their 3rd year of dental school, and one regional-based exam that had come under some scrutiny nationally after they graduate. And again, anytime we can eliminate postgraduate requirements, that dramatically improves the amount of time that it takes to get a license. And so we worked with Marquette Dental School to present to the dental board, and what they demonstrated before the dental board was that their testing regimen for the competencies necessary to pass that exam was far more rigorous than that one-day exam. And so as a result, the board approved them as a testing organization, and on the strength of the rigor of that testing, those students now do not have to take that regional exam from a third-party entity. And we licensed, I believe, over 50% of the class within 3 days of graduation. And so all of that leads us to a place of, like, what does that mean? Like faster is good. At least we always think faster is good. But in what is the value that returns to the citizens of Wisconsin? Well, so based on the data from the Legislative Audit Bureau's study of the department, that data was used to facilitate an economic analysis of the dollars, the net wages that those students would have received as a result of being licensed faster in fiscal year 23. And that resulted in $54 million more just in wages, not in net economic impact, but just in wages for those students here in the state of Wisconsin. So I can say confidently, as a department whose whole budget is only about $60 million a year, that's a pretty big deal for not just our students, but really the entire state of Wisconsin. A couple of other items that the department is working on, which I find interesting. I'll highlight first, better regulation through data. One of the things that I think is so critical is that we continue to support the work that we do through data and actually work to get more proactive using that information. And so I'll talk about that in a couple of ways. The first way is workforce surveys. So there's sort of, everybody knows, or many people know, that there's a nursing workforce survey which is required by statute. The department for the last 3 or 4 years has engaged in doing optional surveys for physicians and dentists, and upcoming we will be doing survey work with our social workers and
all of our behavioral health.
All of our behavioral health professions who renew in the spring. The reason for that is because the department is sort of in a unique position of knowing the entire universe of those employed professions here in the state of Wisconsin. And so it gives us unique access to be able to query who these people are, where they work, where they practice, more importantly, and the type and level of work that they're doing, specialty and level of work. And I'll give you a quick example of this. So I was at a national conference and we were talking with the state of Utah. And I just thought this was so compelling. The state of Utah knew they had a mental health care worker shortage, right? And we've heard that here in the state of Wisconsin too. And so they set out through workforce surveys like these to quantify that shortage. And so when they started this process, they took a look at their raw numbers. They said, oh, we've got, and I forget the exact number, but it's like 3,000 to 5,000 mental health care workers, and that means we've got, a 60% shortage. And so that was the frame they were operating under, is sort of that level of shortage. But when they actually queried the professionals who were in the field doing this work, they discovered, you want me to hold them up? They discovered very quickly that the shortage was actually dramatically bigger because while they had that many people working in that field, not everybody was actively providing care. Not everybody was providing sort of that bedside or that chairside care on it. And even those who weren't necessarily providing that care full time. And so when they sort of filtered out the people who held the license but weren't really working in the field, when they filtered out the people who were maybe part-time or had 3/4 time plus administrative responsibilities, they very quickly realized their shortage was orders of magnitude larger. I think it was almost triple what they expected it to be. And that completely changes not just how you address the issue, but it also changed for them where they addressed the issue, because they started to understand better where the shortages actually were in relationship to the patients who needed assistance. And so the workforce data is important to not necessarily directly to the work that we do, but when we talk about the broader state context and about when we're looking at investing in our technical college system or our UW system or our private colleges and where we're putting these funding, the reality is that if a student's educated in a particular locality, there's, I believe, over a 70% likelihood that they stay within 30 miles of that college or university. So that is just one example of how we as a state could start to invest more directly in the pipeline for our licensed professionals that would yield to helping to stem the tide on some of those workforce shortages. And then the last thing really, I think, is more directly related to the work that you all do, and it's about public safety. You all see the cases that come before you when you have your screening panels and you do your board work. My goal, my personal goal, would really be to put that out of business. When we're catching these people after the fact, not adhering to the statutes and rules that they're required to adhere to, we're actually losing the battle on public safety, right? The best version of the work that we do is getting out in front of that, better informing, making sure we have a better educated and more capable licensed community. And for me, how I see the department's role in that work is by doing that through better data. So it's about capturing information on the common complaints that come before you all. It's about getting that information in the hands of employers and in the hands of educators who can better educate students and others on the traps and the pitfalls that people are falling into. And quite frankly, particularly when I think of our employers, one of the most difficult things as an employer is to manage liability, right? And so if they know where the liabilities are, they will be our active partners in making sure that their employees are up to speed and aware of those traps and pitfalls. Let's see. I feel like I've been talking for eons now. What time do we got? 12:54. So I think all of that leads me into where we're going next. I think we're coming up on budget season, and that is always a special time of year here in the state of Wisconsin. But I think it's critical to start talking about this now. The department's ask was very robust 2 years ago, and it's going to be, and it is, for those of you who've seen it, we submitted it in September, very robust this year. You know, honestly, after decades of disinvestment by members of both parties, this administration, the Governor Evers and the Biden-Harris administration, via ARPA dollars, invested heavily in this department. So those dollars didn't just support modernization; those dollars also supported augmented staffing for the department. And our request this year puts us in a position to replace those dollars with full-time staff at the department, continuing to provide the same level of service that quite frankly, our employers and citizens and applicants need and deserve here in the state of Wisconsin. And so I don't like doing long lists, but I will maybe cherry pick a few of the items that were submitted in the budget to give you an idea of the types of requests that we're asking for. So we asked for 14 full-time call center staff. To give you an idea, that's replacing 6 two-year project positions that were provided in the last budget. That's also replacing over 15 contracted call center agents that we currently have. Our data shows that our FTE are generally more productive and can better answer questions on a first call than a contracted call center service. And so while 6 and 15 don't equal 14, we believe that 14 is the number that would be equivalent from a work productivity standpoint. We're asking for 10 credentialing staff. That replaces the ARPA staff that we will be losing at the end of the biennium. That does not replace the project staff we got in the last budget. So in the last budget, I believe it was 6 four-year project positions. So we will continue to utilize those 6 project positions and then address that request in an oncoming budget. In addition to that, we are also requesting 2 FTE attorneys. So many of the professions in the room who are prescribing professions, you're probably used to and understand that the CSB goes through a process of referring cases before your board. And these 2 attorneys are attorneys that are directly responsible or would be directly responsible and tasked to moving those cases through quickly. I think one of the things as a department that we're very cognizant of is that anytime somebody enters the disciplinary process, whether warranted or not only is delayed outcome not good for the complainant, but it also creates a level of stress on that provider and that license holder during the period of time that they're undergoing that. And so what we want to seek to do, particularly with sensitive cases like the CSB referrals, is to get those people in, get the information, and move them out as quickly as possible, either if that's for better protection of the public into a higher level of discipline or out of the disciplinary process altogether. Let's see. I'll talk about a couple of fun ones just because I don't know that everybody's aware of some of the things that we do. I was actually just up in Green Bay yesterday. We issued our 3rd round of youth firefighter training grants. So the department, we do a lot of things that people don't know about, but one of the things that we do is we regulate the firefighting industry here in the state of Wisconsin. And specifically, we regulate firefighter safety. And so we issued roughly $24,000 to the Kewanee Junior Firefighters Program. And what that money specifically tasked with is the training and development of 17 and 18-year-olds to be prepared at 18 to take and pass Firefighter 1 training, which allows them to join their local volunteer fire department. Volunteer firefighters here in the state of Wisconsin make up over 70% of the firefighting service. And I'll stop, or I'll pause there and just say firefighting is sort of a misnomer. I think one of the things that we find so incredible about our local fire departments is fires make up less than 1% of what a fire service, what a member of a fire service does. You know, whether it's you know, getting a cat out of a tree, and believe me, I've heard lots of those stories. They actually happen, or it's rescuing somebody who might get trapped during ice fishing season. Our fire service is really the backbone of public safety in our local communities, and it goes much broader than just being a firefighting service. And so we're very proud of that grant program because our fire service, particularly our volunteer service, has been woefully understaffed for many decades now. And as our existing cadre of volunteers continue to age out, we need to start to replace those volunteers as quickly and as early as possible in our local communities to make sure that remains viable as a public safety solution here in Wisconsin. We also do water quality support through the POUTS Fund. So for businesses, low-income businesses, and homeowners who can't afford to replace a failing POUTS system, they can apply through their counties, participating counties. Not all counties do participate, but most do, to receive a grant from the department to help with the cost, help offset the cost of replacing. And I should stop using acronyms. So septic system, right? I like talking about it. I think it's nobody else's favorite topic. But they are critically important, not just the quality of life of that homeowner or that business owner, but also to overall public safety, because we all share the water table, and we all need to be good stewards of those resources and make sure that those failing systems don't negatively impact our neighbors around us. A lot of this is sort of other administrative gobbledygook, so I won't go through it. But I think the key takeaway that I want you to have relative to our budget is in essence, let's keep the good times rolling, right? The reality is we've found a level of investment that has yielded outcomes, not just for the department, but for the broader community, for the license holders, for the license applicants. And we really want to make sure that we continue that work moving forward. The last thing I'll end on is a story, which is a bit gratifying for me. So we were recently in the state of Michigan, meeting with colleagues from across the region. And 3 years ago, I think there was a lot of discussion of quite frankly, can this department do anything right? I'll raise my hand and say I heard it more than once. And what I'm hearing now is, I'm hearing states like Michigan, I'm hearing states like Indiana. I've taken calls from the state of Texas, from Iowa, from Illinois, trying to think, from Maryland is the most recent example, who are not just wondering, can this department in this state do anything right? They're actually coming to us for solutions. They're saying, how did you fix this problem? What approaches did you take? Who did you work with? And so to have been here now for just a little over 2 years and to have experienced the place that we were and the place that we've come to now, to be not just doing well by our own standards, but doing well by national standards, that's incredibly gratifying. And while I'm happy to stand up here and be a part of taking credit, the credit goes to all of the staff that raised their hands earlier. The credit also goes to you all, the work of the boards. For the entire middle section of my remarks, you heard me talking not just about my work, but about partnering with the pharmacy board, about partnering with the nursing board, about partnering with the dental board. That's the sort of collaboration and sort of creative thinking that yields results for people. And that's why we're so incredibly proud of this work. So I promise I will try not to drone on anymore, and I do want to turn this to be more of a dialogue. And I guess I'll say I'm just here to answer your questions. I think very little's off the table. I'll say very little to give myself an out. So I just do a hand raise maybe, and then I can walk a mic over or repeat the question.
I have a question for you. So I went through appraisal credentialing years ago, and I was on hold with the DSPS forever because I had a non-traditional application for my appraisal credential, and I remember it'd be an hour and a half. Sometimes I'd get hung up on, and this was back in 2015, 2016.
Mm-hmm.
So do we know how much times have improved on the initial call side? Even taking a snapshot of 2 years ago and now, are we in a better place?
Yeah, we're certainly in a better place. I think we're looking at a lot of different sort of methods of improvement here. But what I'll say on the simple front is we added contracted call center services. We did get 6 2-year project positions in the last budget, and prior to the last budget, with the addition of the call center services, which actually at the time were at 21 people, we went from roughly a 30% call answer rate to, I believe it was over a 93% answer rate. And so it did dramatically improve our ability to answer people's questions. I think the question that always sort of comes to mind for me next is those second and tertiary metrics, which are quality metrics, right? Are we getting repeat calls about the same thing because we're not answering the call the first time? Are we, how effectively are these people in the call center communicating and answering the questions? Our department issues over 200 different types of licenses. So for a call center staff person to be responsible for having the depth of knowledge to address every single caller and every single question is pretty much untenable. So what we identified is we really had to start thinking more multimodal about how we're communicating with people. So one of the things that I didn't mention, which is big for this year, and John is leading the charge on that, calling you out, is we are redoing our entire website. So I think for most people, when they have a question, that's where they start, is how do we access this information via the website? And our website right now, I think, how many clicks did it take to get the information on average, John?
I don't know.
I think the metric people usually look for is like less than 3, right? But I want to say it was like over 10 or almost 10 clicks to get to most information that people were seeking. And that just doesn't work, because by the 4th or 5th click, you're closing out the website and you're picking up the phone and you're calling, because that just seems like it's more effective at that point. So we're overhauling the website. Another thing that we did is we launched, I'll call it a pilot, simply because we haven't been able to do a broader launch yet, but we launched a live agent chat feature. So now, after you log into your application, so it's only available if you're in the application process and only after you've logged in. But the idea was, if you have a specific question at that time about the application you're working on, there's somebody that you can talk to get that answer sort of in real time, and to keep moving and making progress through that application process. Ultimately, we would love to launch that feature more broadly, but when you're using live agent chat, every live agent is one less person that can be doing phones or something else. And so we sort of have to balance both sort of on demand and efficacy standpoint. We are looking at right now at adding bots to the chat feature at some point, and I believe at that point we would be able to launch that feature more broadly. And then the third thing that we've done is we've added or we've started directing people wherever possible to submit a support ticket. I recognize that I will say up front that sounds like a very bureaucratic process, and in many ways it is. However, the reality is when you're talking to somebody on the phone, you're going to always spend the first 3 minutes just hearing and receiving what the person's saying and understanding the frustrations. And while that's really great for our mental health, that leads to really poor call time metrics. And so I know I'm this way. When you can put something down on paper in writing, people tend to be much more succinct and direct about what their concern is and the questions that they need answered. And so by directing people to the support ticket functionality, it allows us to do that work. And then the last thing that we're working on, both in support of answering support tickets and in support of setting up a bot-assisted chat function, is FAQs. A high proportionality of the incoming calls, emails, chats, whatever, end up being about the same 5 or 6 topics most of the time. And so what we're working on is sort of distilling that into formats to, again, all this is the idea. Let's help people help themselves. I know I'm this way. If I can avoid talking to a human to accomplish a task, that's where I'm going to live 99% of the time. And so we as a department really want to empower people with the information and the tools necessary to conduct the business they're seeking to conduct.
Question about plan review and what improvements are being made to reduce the wait time.
Well, what's a good wait time, I would ask?
Usually 2 weeks, and we wait 6 weeks right now. And there was also a legislative committee a year and a half ago that made the recommendation to adopt the scheduling of reviews. And DSPS has elected, I believe, not to move forward with that. And do you know anything about that?
Yeah, 100%. So 30 days is our current standard. We seek not to exceed 30 days during any time of the year. Our average during most of the years is around 2 weeks. And I have the data to support that. So the reality is plan review, the reality about plan review is by historic standards, the department is doing better and faster than it's ever done before. Scheduling plan review, a great option to have, right? I would love to be able to provide that service, but the reality is when we had that service, it was being abused. Our data showed us that over 60% of the plans in our system when we had that were what I call ghost bookings. They were people who were booking out 2, 3, 4 plans for the same project with the idea that they would submit the plan when they were ready to submit it. Why is that a problem for the department? That means that we've tapped and reserved that resource for that plan at that time, and if we don't find out more than 2 days in advance that we're not getting a plan, it means we're wasting that resource's time. And we don't have the capacity, the staff capacity to do that. And so we did propose in the last budget adding additional staff in order to provide that service. I believe it was roughly about 10 additional staff geared towards providing that service. The legislature opted not to provide those staff, and so we opted not to provide that service.
One of the ways to reduce the call or the case volume on the screening panels might be to increase the inspections and that type of thing. Was there anything added to the budget to increase inspection or to work on inspections of pharmacy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think pharmacy inspections are a critical thing. And John, as you know, it's something that's been a sore spot for several years. The department, I think going back about 8 years at one point, did have a part-time pharmacist, an LTE pharmacist on staff. The reality is the compensation for an LTE pharmacist is not sufficient to recruit and retain a pharmacist to do inspections. And pharmacy, the practice of pharmacy, has become more and more complex over the many decades. And so when we start to talk about it's one thing to go in and inspect a retail Walgreens or a CVS, but when we start to talk about inspecting things like nuclear pharmacy or compounding, the expertise necessary goes up very quickly. And so I'm glad you called that out because I didn't mention it. It was on my sheet. We asked for 1 FTE pharmacy consultant to do pharmacy inspections here in the state of Wisconsin. I think the other thing that is really a side benefit of that request, which isn't necessarily talked about, is a lot more pharmacies are now doing mail service. What that means is we have pharmacies here in Wisconsin producing pharmaceuticals who are then shipping those pharmaceuticals to other states who have their own requirements to allow that pharmacy to conduct business in their state. And oftentimes one of those requirements is annual inspections, which is not something that's required. And so having an FTE pharmacy consultant would allow us to provide that on-request inspection service to allow those pharmacies here in the state of Wisconsin who are interested in shipping to more states than just the state of Wisconsin. It would facilitate that work better.
Are you seeing any trends in upcoming legislation in the state of Wisconsin that would impact our board?
Well, there's always something.
I know.
You know, I think over the last session we saw a lot of different legislation. I will say in healthcare, the overarching trends are flexibility, right? Whether we're talking about things like telehealth or we're talking about things like interstate licensing compacts. Wisconsin, I'll say on licensing compacts, has been on the forefront of adopting most, if not all, of the licensing compacts. There's very few we have not adopted. And I think, and I'll just say it's a bit of a nerdy problem to have, but when you look at government and how government's designed, government is designed around these boundaries that exist, right? These they call them political boundaries, but I don't mean political in the election sense. I mean, right, political in the geographic sense. And to people these days, those boundaries are in many ways meaningless, right? I may live in Wisconsin, but I may do most of my business in Illinois, or I may do most of my business in Minnesota. And even myself, I was just recently in the state of Washington for a family funeral, and I got ill, if you can't hear, congestion, and needed services at that time from an institution that was allowed by the state of Wisconsin and the state of Washington to provide me with services. And so when those boundaries, disappear, the traditional structures of government that provide for the oversight and regulation of these licensed professionals or these industries, those start to disappear too, because so many of our government structures are conceived of around those geographic boundaries. And so this is the nerdy part, right? Like, it's a really interesting question where it's very clear to everybody today that we need to find a way to facilitate those services and to facilitate that work that's already happening. But we're not necessarily well equipped to do that. So how do we start to reimagine government structures in a way that allows us to do that? And I know for the state of Wisconsin, compacts are the tool that at this point our state and many other states have settled on as a primary means. Now, what I will say is that's also not going to be an end-all be-all, because compacts require funding to set up, which means they require fees, and not every profession is going to be large enough across the country to facilitate the funding of a national compact. And so there isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all. We're going to have to come up with different methodologies for supporting that work, depending on the profession and the industry we're talking about.
Is there any trend coming with unified testing, where whatever requirements are in one state that the whole nation adopts?
Yeah, I think in many ways we're largely there in terms of unified testing for individual professions. I will say the differences tend to come in things like the various substandards. So
and beyond testing, all the requirements to get a license to be unified.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I meant to go around earlier and I didn't do that. What board are you in?
I'm with the Joint Board of Architects, Engineers, Landscape Architects, Land Surveyors, and Designers, and Interior Designers. So there's a lot of that discussion going on.
Yeah, I know the engineers and architects have a pretty good unified regimen. I will say, in terms of the testing, most of the and I think, and forgive me if I'm getting this not quite correct, but I think either architects or engineers, maybe both, have kind of a multi-state registration process. So you get your original license, and then you're on the multi. They don't call it a compact, but it's kind of like that. And then you register for each new state that you're.
They're actually now moving into international compacts.
Okay. So, I think the trend is towards that, and I think just very naturally, as there's been consolidation of accreditation and testing organizations by profession nationally, we've seen more homogeny in the requirementing. I think where it gets kind of dicey is when you get into the nitty-gritty of individual professions, and a great example is our mental behavioral health professions. And I'll just pick on Minnesota to Wisconsin. So in terms of our substance abuse counselors, there is a vast difference in the amount of hours necessary in order to hold that license, supervised work hours necessary to hold that license. And then moving that on to social work, while the hours are substantially similar, the way those hours are broken out into subcategories is vastly different between the two states. And so that, I know, at least from a departmental perspective, often causes us a lot more grief than the testing piece. I think the other item that can be a bit sticky sometimes is if the university accreditors, so sometimes the testing accreditors and the university accreditors are not the same, and sometimes they are the same. But if they are not, a lot of times you have regional accreditation for the universities, and a state like Wisconsin may pick our regional accreditors to sort of automatically approve, and then that creates a much more arduous process when it comes to reviewing the education of those coming from states who use different accreditors. And so I think there probably is some work that could be done in that space. I will say, and again, I'll nerd out on this piece for a little bit of a moment. One of the really fascinating things in occupational licensing is the fact that while the state of Wisconsin has requirements, many of the requirements that are perceived by the license holders are actually not board requirements or state requirements. They're actually requirements that are put on them by these national accreditors and these national testing organizations. And so for instance, the pharmacy is kind of a great example of that. In the state of Wisconsin, for pharmacy, we have no requirement that you have to graduate before you take your national exam. Now, you have to graduate in order to get a license, but the exam piece is not our requirement. It is the NABP who has that requirement that you have to graduate first. And so this is the piece I find very fascinating, is that there's these layers of requirements that are placed on an applicant who to take a test or to graduate from a school that aren't necessarily layers of requirements that we have directly, but we have them indirectly because we require them to graduate or we require them to take that test. And so in many ways, again, pharmacy was a great example of that. We've done a lot of work trying to reimagine how we work with those entities and within those requirements to maximize the ability of students, again, to move through those at the pace that they choose and that's right for them. We have at the department, because at the end of the day, the work, at least on the licensing side of the world, right, the work that you all do, the work that we do, is about people really living out their hopes and their dreams. And so it's incumbent upon us to facilitate sort of handing them the keys to the car, so to speak, right? Giving them the power to drive that process forward.
Megan Jackson, head chair of the Cosmetology Board. We have a barrier where we have a lot of our licensees have criminal backgrounds. One of the things we really doing good for with the turnaround time for a minute now, we kind of see this slow up. What can we do if a person commits the crime in the state of Wisconsin to kind of work with the Department of Corrections to kind of get those records over to our system instead of, because what we run into is a lot of our licensees or people that want to become licensed, they have to run around to each jurisdiction and try to get the records from the court. And the court is asking, well, what is exactly what you need? And, and it becomes a deterrent for them to even so they do unlicensed practice. And so how can we make that process a little bit more streamlined so we can get them licensed a little quicker?
Yeah, I've had a lot of conversations about that going back at least 6 years. In fact, we bought Department of Corrections and Department of Workforce Development over to the office, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago now. And what we've discovered is it really becomes a capacity issue on the Department of Corrections end. So, for us, as long as those records are coming, as the applicants providing those records, we don't, if DOC's helping them or the city's helping court, it doesn't really matter. And so we asked that same question, and it was because those folks have limited access to computers and other types of records request systems without supervision.
Right.
They need to have DOC staff sort of tasked on hand during that whole process, and DOC has said that they just don't have the capacity to provide that. The DWD at different points has stepped up and stepped in to help provide that, but there's a lot, I've noted a lot of staff turnover in those DWD positions tasked to DOC. And so oftentimes it sort of fits and starts, right? We'll be going good for a couple weeks, a month, and then the position turns over and we've got to sort of re-educate people and get people back on board. I think the safest thing to do that I would recommend would be to recommend that they use the predetermination process, because that's good for up to a year. So they could start 6 months, 7 months in advance of even submitting an application, and do that record gathering, sort of elongate that time on the pre-application side. But that way they know by the time they get to us, they're good. The other thing that we've been working on internally with the records gathering process, because while our attorney review times are very low right now, less than a week and a half for legal reviews, that records gathering process is 4 weeks, 6 weeks. I mean, you know this. I requested my birth certificate from, I think it was Morris County, Illinois, and you get back the automated message saying this will take 6 to 8 weeks. So if you have to do that for dozens or hundreds of records, that really can be discouraging and problematic. And so my best recommendation is just to do that predetermination process, start early. Our attorneys recently began working with our paralegals to create a group to help to start asking for those records at the beginning of the application process, as opposed to after the other parts of the application have been finished. Certainly I hope that helps too, to again kind of give people a longer window to be active in that process. I think the other thing too that's important is that our Cos and Barber standards on the conviction side are not very strenuous, right? I mean, if you didn't do it in the practice of, you're likely going to be fine. So it's just a matter of making sure we're crossing those I's and dotting those T's. The other tip I give people is like a lot of government processes, the older a record is, the less impactful it is.
Right.
And for us, the standard is roughly in that 7-year range. If it gets much older than 7 years, it becomes less and less impactful. So I always recommend that people start with those most recent things and work your way backwards, because it may get to a point where if it's all of a sudden something that was 15 years ago, maybe just submitting a statement about that thing at this point would be.
One more question. People are asking, what if it was expunged? And I was just like, I don't know. That's not my area of expertise. I said you should probably call and ask. Of course, they get a customer service, but who really doesn't have a direct answer for them. And I was like, well, if you have a record, like I would submit it just in case. But I mean, is that something?
No. Even if it was expunged, they should be submitting it. I'd love to go into more detail on that. I don't think I have the background necessary to get real details on that, but that's my understanding.
So I'm on the Commercial Building Code Council, and we are a couple of years removed now from having passed the Wisconsin review of the International Building Code 2021. And since that point, I know that it's gone through department review, and it went to the legislature, and it went to committee. But as of last August, I don't believe there's been any movement on our commercial building code. Do you know what the status of it is, or are we going to be going through the cycle again for the next model building code for IBC?
Yeah, so the commercial building code is currently the subject of a state Supreme Court lawsuit.
Okay.
I believe my understanding is that written arguments are due in the next couple of months, with oral arguments to follow. And so I don't know that I want to say too much more beyond that. But of course, we as the department would also love to see the code enacted.
Can you say like the elevator pitch of what the issue is that is going to the Supreme Court? Like what is?
Yeah, the crux of the issue has to do with the separation of powers issue. And so the legislature has several committee sort of post-administrative rule process review processes, and some of those processes result in objections. So there's a couple different types of objections, but in essence, the committee can object to the rule, and then there's processes that follow. And so the argument, one side is, of course, arguing that those processes have been put in place by statute and are legal. The other side is arguing that those constitute a violation of separation of powers, because if you authorize somebody to do a thing and then they've done a thing, you shouldn't then also be able to come in on the back end and deauthorize them without subsequent legislation. So that's kind of at a high level what they're talking about.
Okay, so it's kind of beyond the code itself, but more so how it's being reviewed and potentially enacted.
Yeah, it's very much a more fundamental issue, and quite frankly could impact, depending on the outcome, all of the work that all of your boards do. But again, because it's an ongoing suit, I don't necessarily think I should comment too much further.
Okay. Is it safe to say, though, that we're not going to see any movement on the building code for several months then?
I would suspect that, based on what I understand about the timeline of, and again, the court makes its own calendar.
Right.
But I would suspect on the outside that we would see at least some movement in that case within the next 3 months. So now, whether or not that's the last step or that results in, being able to move the code forward at that point, it's anyone's guess. All right, and that's actually a perfect segue to introduce our next guest, who I have to say I'm incredibly grateful that he has decided to join us and provide us some information on his expertise. I will do a brief introduction just because I think understanding his resume is critical. Now, I admit I'm not going to belabor it because I would hate when people do that to me. But just a few quick points. Yale Law School graduate, then Stanford Law School, or Yale graduate, sorry, then Stanford Law School, president of the Law Review, federal prosecutor, and all of that was just before he decided to come home to the state of Wisconsin. So Attorney General Josh Kaul was sworn in January of 2019, and since he has worked on important issues like combating the opioid epidemic in our state, making our communities safer from gun violence, passing legislation to help fight against unsafe drinking water, and work through the backlog of untested sexual assault kits. And so while that is all very impressive work, the work that we care about is the work that he does in partnership with us. And so for those of you who don't know, when cases come before your boards and they go beyond the administrative review process, it's his office and his team that really steps up and partners with us to make sure that we can hold people accountable and that we can keep the citizens of Wisconsin safe. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Attorney General Josh Kaul.
First, thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you all for inviting me. It's good to be here. Let me just start off by saying thank you to all of you for being here and for taking time out of your busy schedules, not just to be here today, but to serve on boards and councils that work on a bunch of issues that impact the state. So that was a perfect segue, because I'd love to start by talking a little bit about the overlap between what we do at the Wisconsin Department of Justice and what DSPS does, and in particular what the boards and the councils do. One of those things is that we are the lawyers for DSPS, and when there's a decision that's challenged, we have attorneys who represent the state and defend that decision. The good news is that doesn't happen that much. People tend to accept your decisions, so that's a good thing. But it does happen from time to time. Now, at the Department of Justice, our mission is to protect the public and ensure that justice is done. And that overlaps actually quite a bit with the DSPS message. I actually wrote it down. I don't have your mission memorized, but protecting the public and promoting progress. That's the mission. So in both agencies, we are worried about the well-being and the health and safety of Wisconsin citizens. And so there's a lot of overlap in the work that we do. One area that I think really shows that overlap is our efforts and the efforts of DSPS to combat the opioid epidemic. You all have been involved in that, both through boards, but also, I suspect, a lot of you through the work that you do professionally, as we have made real progress in Wisconsin over the years. So the PDMP, as you're familiar with, as well as the update with the EPDMP, has been a critical tool for reducing people going to multiple doctors. That, you all know that that's an issue. I can tell you, I was as you heard, a federal prosecutor for part of my career. And I worked on one case where we had people who go to multiple doctors, they get multiple prescriptions, they would illegally sell those prescriptions, and it was a way for fueling addiction and fueling the illegal sale of drugs. So by putting the PDMP in place, as well as other measures that are now there, we've done a lot to curb the illegal sale of opioids, the distribution of opioids, but there's a lot more work to do. We at the Department of Justice have worked to hold pharmaceutical companies, manufacturers, as well as sellers and distributors accountable for their role in the epidemic. And we've now helped to secure about $750 million that's going to go to communities across the state of Wisconsin to support efforts to combat the epidemic. Those funds have started to go to communities, and they're supporting things like treatment programs, residential recovery programs, the supply of Narcan and fentanyl test strips, and a number of other things that are making a difference. We've had a major challenge with the spike in fentanyl, which has become prevalent throughout the drug supply. But things like fentanyl test strips and Narcan are making a difference. And for the first time in quite a long time, the last year's data indicates a drop in overdose deaths, both nationally and here in Wisconsin. Now, there's still a ton of work to do. Those numbers are still way too high. But we have begun to see some real progress being made on that front. And the work that you all have done, that we've done in partnership, and that agencies are doing makes a big difference. So that's one of many areas where we have partnered. We also investigate crimes of statewide importance. That's not something we say to make ourselves feel good. That's actually what the statute says that we're supposed to investigate. And that includes a whole host of different types of cases. But one of them is human trafficking. And the legislature has put in place requirements for certain training on human trafficking that's a part of the licensure process. We really appreciate your engagement as part of that process, because the reality is that we work with referrals. When people have information, they refer it to local law enforcement, and then it might make its way up to our investigators with our Division of Criminal Investigation. That only really happens, though, when people are providing that information either because they see something out of the ordinary and they want to notify law enforcement, or they know the signs. They see somebody who may be potentially the victim of trafficking, and they act. So that's another example of the ways that our agencies work together. We are also in court right now working to protect access to safe and legal abortion in the state of Wisconsin. And our plaintiff in that case, one of the plaintiffs, is the Medical Examining Board, as well as the chair of that board. We're now on our second chair, who has been there since that suit started. But that's an example of how affirmatively we can work together on litigation to address issues, not just being responsive to issues that arise in defending you, though we're happy to do that, but also seeking to make policy change in conjunction, in partnership between our work and the work that boards do with DSPS. So those are a handful of the ways we work together. And ultimately, we are interested in continuing to work together. One area that I think there's a real opportunity in is consumer protection. At DOJ, we have folks who are specifically designated by statute to enforce our consumer protection laws. Primarily, those laws are enforced in Wisconsin by DATCAP. And if it's a run-of-the-mill situation, it's DATCAP that will be handling the enforcement. But if it's an egregious violation, if it's a repeat violator, or if it's something of significant statewide importance, that's where DOJ gets involved. So the opioid cases is an example of the consumer protection work that we do. But we've also seen the unlicensed practice of medicine, for example, or other things that could raise consumer protection concerns. There again, we work based on referrals. So if you are seeing a systemic issue in your area that you are providing oversight on, we're interested in hearing about that. DATCAP is as well, and that's a great first place to stop. But where there is major violations of the law, consumer protection violations, we are interested in hearing from you and figuring out whether there's a way that we can work together to address that through our consumer protection teams. So we certainly encourage folks who have information about consumer protection issues to reach out to us, because we are more than happy to work in conjunction with you to address those issues. So there is a lot of work where we're overlapping. There are a lot of topics where if there is interest in partnering, we're available to do that. But I also want to speak to the importance of the work that you all do and the importance of your public service on these boards and on councils. Because the reality is that while there are headlines in the paper occasionally about some hot and button issue, like a few of the ones I mentioned before, much of the work of government, much of the work of making progress for our citizens is done not in the big flashy cases or big flashy issues, but is done through decisions that are made one at a time by people who are working in and on behalf of state government. There are thousands of those decisions made every day. You all see those decisions come before you on your boards as part of your councils. Those decisions, arguably more than anything else, cause us to make progress on issues that are impacting the people of the state of Wisconsin. It's not going to get you in the newspaper. It may not get you widespread acclaim, but it makes a difference in the lives of our fellow citizens. So it's really rewarding, important work, and we are grateful for it. And I also know it's not without controversy. I didn't expect that the appointments to our boards would become politicized, but I think we've all read enough in the paper to see that in fact has happened. And so what I think for a lot of you was probably thinking you were signing up for a meeting here and there, in some cases has been exactly that, and in other cases has been a far more heated, contentious process than maybe you were anticipating. And I'll say a few things about that. First, people wouldn't care about it if it wasn't important. So the fact that people are getting engaged about this and are exercised is something that I think is a reflection of the importance of the work that you're doing. Secondly, I know that the process is not a fair one. It's not a process that I like some of the outcomes we've had. What I can say is that I think that confirmations should be done based on people's qualifications for the job that they have applied for, not based on partisanship or based on legislative maneuvering. But I encourage everybody to approach the job the same way, which is to do the right thing, to make the difference that you want to make on behalf of the public while you're in those roles, regardless of what happens in the confirmation process. Because the reality is that rarely what happens there has much to do with the substance or the merits. I've talked to a few people who went through that process and were not confirmed in recent years and have been able to pass along that I think it's a bit of a badge of honor. So having people who are committed to doing the right thing is key, and the political process will play out as it does. At the same time, having people who are doing the right thing, who are applying their expertise, using their experience, leads to good decision making. Now, that's a good thing if you're concerned about the public interest, but there are private interests, special interests that don't always want those kinds of outcomes. And so it's part of the process that people will want to interfere with that. They would rather have decisions made based on connections or lobbying than based on the merits of issues. And that's part of the reason we see the controversy that we do. I think it's really valuable to have experts, to have people who have experience, who are helping to make these decisions that set standards that, let's be honest, there's a question about the building code before, I'll come back to that in a minute. There are not a lot of people in this building who are qualified to weigh in on what the building code standards should be. Having people who bring the expertise that you do, that's one of numerous examples, but having people who bring the expertise you do helps make our communities safer. It helps us make progress. It helps make sure that people who should be getting licensed are getting licensed. It's also really good for our economy, by the way, because in addition to protecting consumers who are trying to obtain services, it makes sure that we have a level playing field for businesses to compete on. I talk to businesses across the state. Our business owners want to do the right thing. They want to look out for the clients that they're serving, but they also don't want to be undercut by the person down the street or across the state who's cutting corners and potentially putting them out of business. By making sure that we have fair rules and a level playing field, and the work you do helps do exactly that, we're helping promote the business owners who are doing the right thing. We're helping to promote a strong and growing economy where you're succeeding because of the quality of the work you're doing, not because you found an additional corner to cut that might undermine consumer protections. So we've worked at DOJ to strengthen our agencies. There was an effort, 2011 was really the key point of this, an effort to undermine the strength of our agencies, to limit their ability to put rules in place. There was a statute passed in 2011, Act 21, which was meant to limit the ability of agencies to get things done. And it did, to some degree, limit that. But it was also the case that some attorneys, including attorneys, my predecessor, worked to read those laws very restrictively. So one of the issues that was on the table when I came to office was an AG opinion. I have the authority to issue opinions in certain circumstances, but it was an opinion on a rule that had been passed that required that sprinkler heads be installed in rental units that house 4 or more different families. The contrary position limited it to rental units with 20 or more families. And as you can imagine, it's a lot safer to have those sprinkler units in place regardless of the size of the unit, but especially when you're talking about lots of people, 18 families, 15 families, than it is not to have those. So we looked at that opinion, we withdrew the prior opinion, and we issued a new opinion making clear that that rulemaking was permissible. And what was interesting is, and this is such a good example of the importance of the work that you do, the public reaction to that came more than anybody from fire chiefs. And we heard fire chiefs saying, this is a step in the right direction because we know what it's like to respond to a fire, and we know what a difference it makes to have a sprinkler head in place. It's a small example, but it highlights the importance of the work that's being done to put in place common sense rules that protect consumers, that protect people who are acquiring services. So we have worked to make sure that that law is not overinterpreted and doesn't hamstring you all from doing the work that you're doing. Another challenge we have in Wisconsin is the legislative veto process. Wisconsin has statutes that go back decades that allow legislative committees to block administrative rules from going forward. It's part of a broader overview of agency action by legislative committees that Wisconsin has set up. The federal government does not allow for that. It's considered unconstitutional by the federal government. Most states that have considered the issues don't allow for it. I think there's one other state, and I think they passed a constitutional amendment specifically to allow for this. But Wisconsin's a major outlier. And so one of the things we have worked to do is to reclaim the ability of agencies to use their expertise without political interference. A while ago we filed a suit. It's called Evers versus Markline, where we asked the Supreme Court to take up several issues involving legislative review of agencies. One of them was the DNR had tried to use conservation funds, but that was blocked by a legislative committee. A second one, you probably remember this, involved pay raises for UW employees. They were approved in the budget, but then the legislature blocked the release of the funds. Ultimately, there was a deal struck on that allowed the funds to be spent. But we also challenged the blocking of administrative rules, the building code in particular, as well as a rule that bans conversion therapy. So the Supreme Court, when we raised those issues, took up the first of them, the expenditure of DNR funds. So they considered whether agencies, if they get money appropriate to them, if they can spend it on their own, or if they have to go back to a committee to get the thumbs up before those funds are expended. And the court ruled in our favor. And most excitingly, it was 6-1. We get a lot of 4-3 votes from our Supreme Court. But on this one, it was 6-1. And the court found that that is unconstitutional. The legislature is a legislative body. It passes laws, but the execution of the laws belongs to the executive branch, agencies. So there we had a big victory. And then the court asked us, okay, well, what should we take up these other issues? And we suggested that the court take up the administrative rulemaking issues. And so right now, pending before the Supreme Court is whether legislative committees have the authority to block agencies from acting, to block you when you take action from having that go into effect, or whether legislative review is required. Our argument is that that's the same principle as the expenditure of money, that the legislature's job is to legislate. It's not to take over the execution of the law. That's what they have done. They can fully block those laws, so they have basically given themselves a veto over the execution of the law, and that's inconsistent with our separation of powers. So we've got a really good precedent from this recent decision, but it's a different issue than the one involving the expenditure of money. The other side is going to say rulemaking is more like a legislative activity than expending funds. We're going to argue it's not. It's purely an executive activity. In that case, we'll shape the authority that our boards and our agencies have going forward. So more to come on that issue, but that gives you a bit of an overview of some of the things that we're doing that interact with what agencies are doing, and hopefully support you all in the work that you're doing, because it is fundamentally important work. It makes a difference to the people of our state, and having people who are doing it thoughtfully, conscientiously, ethically helps make Wisconsin safer. It helps make our communities better. It helps businesses know that they're going to get feedback or responses within a certain period of time, and it makes a difference in people's lives. So I want to thank you all for the work that you are doing. I want to thank you for having me, and say that we look forward to continuing to work together in the years ahead. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.